15. Dagda's Wheel. The door at the end of the hangar slid open silently. Goivni strode in and halted before his waiting guests. The light gleamed brightly on the reflective visor of his helmet, and his fingers moved in unceasing agitation. I have decided to adopt your suggestion. It will be interesting to observe how the experimental subjects respond to life without any guiding influence. Might it not be a good idea to reconfine the reject materials? The doctor suggested to Goivni. That would be an essential procedure for the continuing successful development of the experiment. I have issued instructions to my mobile surveillance units to locate the reject material. What's he talking about? Asked Bathsheba. Yes, why can't he talk normally? Stuart agreed. It irritated him that the alien could not make himself clearly understood. The doctor explained Goivni's words. He meant that he's using his dragons to locate the demons. Dragons? Goivni exclaimed, with some surprise filtering through his voice synthesizer. That is the name that the Hern creature used for my surveillance units. Hern, the doctor mused. Yes. Where does he fit into your experiment? He does not. I created the Hern specimen in an experiment on Troifres. My initial research for creating a sociological world model involved working on a wide range of protoplasmic material types. One of these, the basic model which I eventually used to create subject species number 3, in the course of irradiation sequencing, underwent a severe mutation, producing a human-type being in the Hern creature. Unexpected, and contravening the laws of conservation of mass and energy though this was, it was nothing to the fact that I later discovered that the Hern creature perceives effect before cause, thus running against the psychological expansionist and thermodynamic arrows of time. It was the Hern creature who gave the initial suggestion that I should look to the legends of the Sol system for my experimental model. The doctor considered this explanation, and related it back to what he had seen of Hern. So, he perceives effect before cause. That would explain a lot. Would it? Stuart asked. Are you saying that this Hern bloke goes backwards in relation to everyone else? That's a very succinct way of putting it. I wonder to what extent he has a true contratemporal existence. He has resisted all my attempts to analyse him, Goivni told the doctor. Hardly surprising if he knows in advance the ways in which you would no doubt test him. Perhaps that is the case. Goivni seemed annoyed. Now, if you would come with me, I shall view the locations of the rejects. He led them out of the hangar, along a featureless corridor, and into a large dark room, one wall of which gave off a dim luminescence. The other walls were bare. Seating for 3 human subjects, Goivni commanded, and 3 forms rose out of the floor. Stuart eyed them with interest. There had been no indication, no cracks, no panels, that the chairs had been concealed there. They had simply extruded themselves and were continuous with the material of the floor. The doctor sat on one of them, and it instantly contoured itself to fit him perfectly. Bathsheba and Stuart followed suit. World map of experiment code Turnog, surveillance unit locations. The wall suddenly became a screen, showing an overview of the entire world of Tir Na Nog. Bathsheba leaned forward excitedly, hardly noticing that her seat changed to accommodate her new posture. She had seen a map of Tir Na Nog drawn by her brother David, and so she could pick out familiar places. A bright red light glowed where Dinorban lay and acted as a reference point for Bathsheba. To the north of Dinorban were the forests of Coed, the mountains of the Allen Cliff, and the land of the Clear. To the south lay the forest of the Shay, the land of Tyrion, which the people of Lord Barras and the Firbolg hotly disputed, and the mountains where the Formois dwelled. To the west of Dinorban, beyond the southernmost extremities of the mountains of the Allen Cliff, were the Marches, which stretched for more than 100 miles before they reached the sea. To the east lay farmlands, then a low range of mountains, and then nothing, a barren wasteland which had never been crossed, and hence was unmapped by the cartographers of Tir Na Nog. On this map, it was equally devoid of features. Over the surface of the map moved 30 or so white pinpricks of light, the dragons, if Bathsheba understood what had been happening correctly. Relay targeting information from surveillance units to screen, including last known locations and extrapolated movement patterns, Goivni instructed. A host of green dots leapt onto the screen. Most of them were north of Dinorban, and to Bathsheba's eye they appeared to be making towards it. Goivni turned to the doctor. This is the present situation. As you can see, they are too widely spread at the moment. They've been causing havoc all over the place, the doctor told him. But computer analysis suggests that there is some general movement towards the transmat device. This creates an ideal solution to the problem. If, as would seem to be apparent, for some reason the rejects are attempting to escape from the Ternog experiment, then we need merely to reprogram the transmat device to transport them back to the storage module. Aren't you forgetting something? The doctor asked. I hardly think so. I'm a trained scientist, and I take into account all factors when preparing experiments. The possibilities for experimental error are so great that such an approach is essential in even the simplest technique. But the semi-organic silicate computer transfer device is in the middle of a large population at present. For the demons to reach it, they would have to pass through that population. They'd wipe it out, Stuart said. I do not see that as a problem. I can restock from the original source world. How can you be so callous? Stuart asked. These are lives we're talking about, real lives, not fairy tale monsters or aliens. It is not a question of emotionalism, Goivni rebuked him, but of experimental logistics. It would be far simpler in terms of my present resources if I were to take such action as I have planned. But, said the doctor, you aren't taking into account the development of the human species on Earth since you last obtained specimens. When was that? 150 years ago, perhaps? 3,000 Troifan standard time units. I do not understand the relevance of this. The human race has become much more organised. They are going to notice if you abscond with a few thousand people, and I'm afraid that would be against the galactic constitutional regulations regarding interference with species, paragraph number 4654, subsection Wegler, which the Troifran Committee ratified some time ago. Earth is widely regarded as one of the causal nexus points in this galaxy, and your interference would not be acceptable. You'll have to come up with something better than that. Goivni did not reply, staying motionless as he considered the doctor's words. His hands flickered impatiently while he thought. Bathsheba rose and went to sit by the doctor. Eventually Goivni asked tentatively, "What do you suggest?" The doctor smiled broadly. "I suggest that we go out in the field and review the situation as it stands." He rose and beckoned for Goivni to lead the way. Ace didn't have time to flinch back any further before one of Nuada's thick-fingered hands clamped around her leg. "Get off me!" she cried, kicking out at his chest. His other hand reached across and took hold of her ankle. She lashed out again, but in her trainers it was like kicking a tree. Nuada's chainmail clinked as he pulled himself up, using Ace's leg for leverage. "So, I've found a spy," he snarled. Ace swung her fist into the side of his head in another desperate attempt to dislodge him. He flung his weight forwards and knocked her to the floor. "Little demon, aren't you?" He held her down with one knee in her stomach, and her arms pressed to the floor by his strong hands. "Get off!" Ace was scared now. She struggled to get into a position where she could use her legs to attack him. He dug his knee in further. "You've seen my secret." Was it just a breeze that sent his hair writhing and made it look as though there was something shifting under the skin of his face? "What should I do with you?" He blinked, and for a moment his eyes gleamed like fire. "I can't let you go. The Tuatha wouldn't tolerate one of their number being—" He laughed, a harsh, dog-like sound, and again there was that horrible impression of something inside his face. "I suppose they'd call me a witch. If only they could know." "Trelane told me," Ace gasped, "that some witches could change their form. What do you look like under that mask?" "Oh, this is the real me. Or a part of the real me. I had a lot of contributions to what I am now. Perhaps you would like to contribute." "Do I get a badge for my jacket?" She brought a knee up into the small of his back. It sent him sprawling over her, but he no longer gripped her, and she was able to squirm free from him. She pushed herself to her feet and sprinted off down the corridor. His imprecations were loud in her ears as she dodged down a side passage. She went down the first set of stairs that she found and hoped that she could lose him in the maze. At first, the noise of his feet striking the ground sounded close behind her, but after a number of quick direction changes, the sound of his pursuit faded. Feeling safe, Ace paused in her flight and pulled off her trainer. She tenderly tested the joints of her big toe. Those kicks against Noir's armour had hurt like hell, and thankfully they seemed to be intact, though the throbbing refused to go away. She slipped her foot back into the shoe and pulled the laces tight. She had to find Driffid and warn him of the demon in wolf's clothing, but she had no idea how to get out. Once again she found herself wandering through the corridors of Dinorban. Why was this place always so empty? She couldn't find a single person, but surely there must be someone who could take her to the Tuatha. She found herself in a corridor which had alcoves for windows. She had obviously disorientated herself thoroughly, for she was sure she couldn't be anywhere near the outer walls. She stepped into one of the alcoves and looked out. It was dark. Had the sun vanished again? But pushing herself further into the narrow slit, she saw sunlight shining at one end of the darkness. Beautiful, fresh, winter morning sunlight. The window looked into the large tunnel through the wall, and she could now see figures marching towards the huge wooden gates. "Hey, you lot!" she called, hoping that they could hear her. Suddenly, a heavily calloused hand closed over her mouth. "Found you." Driffid led them down the muddy tunnel with Sitheth at his side. When he reached the gates, he stopped, and the mob of people who had gathered stopped a few paces behind him, jostling each other good-naturedly. He stepped forward and placed one hand on either side of the crack which separated the two gates. "Open!" he called loudly. Men hidden in the wall began to operate winches, and a handful of soldiers came forward and lent their weight to the effort. When the doors were fully opened, all fell back behind Driffid, and once more he strode forward. In the light at the end of the tunnel, he could see that he had a welcoming committee. Sitheth inched closer to his side as he came within hailing range of them. Driffid stopped and whispered a few words to his fellow members of the Tuatha De Danann, and then walked on, alone except for the faithful wolf. He stopped a few yards from the waiting emissaries of the assembled armies. The light from Dagda's wheel was captured by his silver hair and made it gleam like a halo around his head. "May we talk of peace?" he asked. The Firbolg, Riad of Tirion, stepped forward. His streaming grey mane fell like a waterfall down his back. His proud chest was swollen, filled with the glorious tasting air. "I have been designated to speak on the behalf of Idvort of the Shay, Broad of the Formois, and my lord Caird of the Firbolg of Tirion. You have acted dishonourably, Driffid. What is ours is yours, and what is yours is ours. You refused to allow to retreat from the enemy because you feared for yourselves. This we cannot forgive." Driffid dropped his head and shame filled his heart. But there was warmth coursing in his veins, and the apology came more easily to him than it would have to a lesser man. "I admit that we are guilty of everything you accuse us of. But I ask you now, may we not unite and fight the demons now that Dagda has shown his favour and returned his wheel to the sky? Now we need not cower in the darkness like troglodytes under fallen skies of stone." "Do you speak for all of your people, Driffid of Dinorban?" Riad asked harshly. "I lead the Tuatha De Danann. I never wanted to leave Tir na Nog. We love the land. For centuries it has nourished us and kept us safe within its tender bosom. The fear was too great for weak men of muscle and sinew. I am sorry for what happened. I cannot begin to convey my full regrets." A smile cracked Riad's stony facade. "You speak truly, Driffid. We too love the land and want to see it restored. We must ask one thing of you if the peace is to be complete. Ask anything if it will bring our peoples closer together. It will. We ask you to destroy the route to the place called Earth. Let there be no more talk of desertion, and the land will be united. Driffid stepped forward and embraced the centaur. Riyadh, it is good to know that we may be friends again. Riyadh returned the embrace, but then pushed Driffid to arm's length. The expression on his face was grave. There is one other matter. Yes? Our united front against the demons will come sooner than you imagined. Our scouts have reported that the demons are moving towards Dinorban. We must ask that you admit our armies so that we may fight. But of course, that would be the proof of our mutual trust. Driffid, with you there is no need for proof of such trust. But we must make haste. Riyadh turned to his two cohorts. Does all that has been agreed satisfy you? The Shay, unfamiliar to Driffid, gave a curt nod. Carreg, the Formois, grunted gutturally in affirmation. Then return to your leaders and prepare them for entry again to Dinorban. We must make haste. Farewell, Driffid. May we meet again shortly. They clasped hands momentarily, and they then parted. Driffid returned to the expectant crowd. We all want peace, he told them, but the demons aim to attack Dinorban. We must allow the armies of our friends to enter the enclosure so that we may defend ourselves. I, Driffid, have given my agreement to this plan. Now, back to your posts and prepare for battle. Jack and David were carried back inside Dinorban with the mass of people. They had lost Stevens and had no idea what was going on. What do you think, David? Should we try and get back to the stone circle? Where's Ace? David asked. What? I don't know. I didn't see her down there. I think we ought to look for her. David? Jack waved a hand in front of David's eyes. David, how long have you known the girl? You're already chasing after her. Come on, I think she must still be inside the castle. Jack, a voice called. Jack looked around and saw Stevens waving to them from the far side of the crowd. Where are you going? David's got some idea into his head about looking for Ace. Good idea. You try and find her. She's one of the few people who'll be able to explain all this to us. Jack shook his head. Bunch of crazies, he said to himself as he hurried after David. Just as the return of the sun had melted the unwilling enmity between the humans and the non-humans of Tir Nan Nog, so it melted the snow which had settled over the ground over the last few days. The earth was churned up into a morass of mud by the hurried preparations to enter Dinorban. Even inside Dinorban, where conditions were already overcrowded, there was a movement of tents further towards the back of the enclosure. The Formois, their limbs already stiffening as their minds reacted to the appearance, near its zenith, of Dagda's wheel, were first to enter. Some stragglers only just made it into the valley and had to be carried on carts away from where they blocked the entrance tunnel. The Shay came in next and swarmed up onto the wall and prepared their weapons for combat. Finally, the Fairbold rode in and gathered around the tunnel. They were unable to man the defences on the wall and would provide a shield should the demons break through the gate. With everyone inside, the gates were swung shut. Driffid was worried that there might be some ill feeling, but the threat of an attack seemed to have staved off any of the immediate repercussions of the siege. Stevens eased himself onto the top of the wall just as the first call went up that a demon had been sighted. He was far too exhausted after going up and down so many flights of stairs, and merely collapsed in a quivering, sweaty heap against a convenient wall of grey rock. But his interest was piqued by everything that had been going on around him, and his curiosity forced him to rise so that he could get a glimpse of this ferocious opponent. At the moment, it was just a speck on the plain of slushy ground, but it was being joined by more and more of its fellows. Stevens cursed the fact that his binoculars were back in his car and strained his eyes to try and pick out some detail. One of the Shay bustled past him, clutching a bundle of arrows under each arm. Further along the wall, a mangonel was being prepared for action, and on the lower level a vat of oil was having fires stoked underneath it. Captain Reese emerged from the entrance to the interior of the wall, saw Stevens, and came over to him. "What are you doing up here?" he asked. "Everybody seems to have lost interest in myself and my friends, so I just followed the flow." "You should get below. We don't need bystanders to hinder operations up here." "I'd rather stay and watch." "Exactly, and you'd get in the way." "Soldier, yes, you there, escort this man down to the civilians' encampment and get someone to look after him." "Yes, sir." He was interrupted by a cry that went up from the soldiers on the lower tier of the wall. Reese and Stevens turned to see what the commotion was about. In the far distance above the advancing demons hovered something else, black against the clear blue sky. It too was heading towards Dinorban, but faster than the demons. "What is it?" Stevens asked. He couldn't believe they had planes or helicopters in Tir Na Nog. "By all that's," Reese spat, "it's the arch-traitor Guivni, come to lead the attack of his agents against us." He forgot the presence of Stevens and turned to shout to the squad of men and Shay who were manning the enormous bolt-flinger. "Get that thing ready," he shouted. "We'll take the fiend out before he even gets close." One of the huge wooden bolts was loaded into place, and the crank turned to prepare it for firing. It did not appear to Stevens that the machine could possibly work, but presumably these people knew what they were at. Driffid and one of the Shay came up to Reese. "What are you doing, Captain Reese?" Driffid asked. "I'm not going to let Guivni gloat over our destruction," Reese snarled.
"Is that why he has come?"
the Shay asked. "With all due respect, my lord Idvord, there can be no doubt about it." "Captain Reese, we should not act too hastily. Let us see what Guivni intends before we strike at him. Maybe, as in days of old, he has come to lend us some help. Have you forgotten what he did to our troops, whom we sent to talk to him when the darkness began?" "Of course I have not, Captain. General Noirda has never let us forget." "Well then." "Captain, I am the leader of the Tuatha de Danann," Driffid reminded him. "I take orders from General Noirda, sir."
"But Noirda is not present,"
Idvort told him.
"In such circumstances, surely your people's leader may command you."
"Yes, sir, but I intend to find General Noirda." He stormed off. Driffid went up to the men on the bolt-flinger. "Relieve some of the tension in this thing. We don't want it going off accidentally, do we?" Stevens approached Driffid and tapped him on the shoulder. "Excuse me, sir." "Yes, what is it? You're one of the Earth people, are you not? I am surprised you did not use the changed circumstances to return to your world. I find all this far too interesting. What is this Guivni thing that is coming here?" "I haven't time to answer questions. I have many things to do." He turned and looked out across the plain. Stevens followed the direction of his gaze to the flying thing. He wondered what it was that could cause such conflicting emotions of hatred from Captain Reese and the yearning love that he had heard in Driffid's voice. David seemed to have some idea of where he was going, for at times he would stride ahead, leaving Jack behind. At other times, though, he would pause inexplicably at a bend in a passageway and immediately double back without a word to Jack. "David, will you stop doing that?" David took a quick right turn. "Doing what?" he called back over his shoulder. Jack rushed forward and took hold of David's shoulder to stop him. "Rushing off ahead of me. I mean, what are you doing? You said we were looking for Ace, but you keep ignoring one corridor and then going halfway up another and then switching direction." "We are looking for Ace. I'm fairly sure she's this way." He pointed off down the passage. "What do you mean you're fairly sure she's this way? How can you tell?" "I've just got this feeling, Jack. Maybe it's her animal magnetism, but it's like she's calling to me. And I'm fairly sure she's calling me this way." "Are you sure it's her? I mean, it might be the Tooth Fairy." "Hey, I'm not talking bull, Jack. Come on, she's this way." He pulled loose of Jack and almost ran up the corridor. Jack gave an exasperated slap to his forehead that followed his friend. What else could he do? The passage ended at a cluster of doors. David looked briefly at them and chose the middle door. He took hold of the black metal ring handle and twisted it. He felt the latch on the other side lift, and so he pushed the door open. Jack peered over his shoulder into the darkness, which the torches lining the passageway barely penetrated. "She's not in there, David," he said smugly. "Come on, let's use a more methodical way of—" "Come in," a voice commanded from the darkness. It was low and gravelly. "Come in, both of you." "Who is that?" Jack asked, but David had already entered. Jack swore, pulled a torch off the wall, and followed him in. "There you are, Jack. I told you she was here." Jack only had time to register that Ace's mouth was gagged before the torch was swept out of his hand and the door pushed shut behind him. He spun round to see who his assailant was. "Well, well," Nuada chuckled. "This is a surprise. I hadn't expected my call to summon Earth people." "My dear," he said to Ace, "one of your friends is a witch." Jack's mind reeled. David had said he'd felt someone was calling him. "Christ's sakes, David! You said it was Ace's animal magnetism." Ace grunted incoherently through the rag tied over her mouth. Jack edged over to her, and when Nuada did nothing, he freed her. She stood up and rubbed her arms to restore her circulation. "You scumbag!" she spat at Nuada. He laughed, and then stabbed the flaming torch at her face. She reeled back. "Now then, I wonder which of your friends has a mark upon his neck." Jack remembered David showing him the unusual birthmark. "David?" he whispered. Why didn't he move? He'd stood there staring at Nuada almost since they'd come into the room. David's mind was elsewhere, hidden memories rising to torment him. They weren't his memories. They belonged to something else. A hell of teeth and claws that lasted for eternity, bound in the subterranean cave pit amongst the amorphous, ever-shifting shapes. A momentary lessening of the pressure, a release into liquid, rising to the surface alone. The light, burning at first, but then attacking the flying creature and assimilating it. The absorption of the small, furry vertebrate, a pulling across the land, calling him from afar. The long journey that lasted many days. The tumbling transition to another world. The search amongst the woods, discovering the intelligent being and entering it. Dormancy. Years of dormancy. And now awakening. Glorious awakening.